Hello and welcome to the first ever Lawyers Weekly webcast. I'm your host, Jerome Dorasami. I'm a journalist with Lawyers Weekly, and today we're going to be talking about a topic that's getting an increasing amount of attention in the Australian legal profession: flexible working and flexible working arrangements. In an increasingly evolving legal marketplace, with new law increasingly coming to the fore and legal tech having a significant impact upon traditional methods of legal service delivery, questions are being asked across the board about what kind of flexible working arrangements can be implemented on an institutional level and for respective individuals. We're very lucky today to have an esteemed panel of guests to discuss the different ways that flexible working can operate in different legal spheres. And I'd like to introduce those guests to you now. First of all, we have Paul Cowling, who's the Managing Director of Lawyers on Demand.
Hi,
Welcome, Paul.
Thanks, Joe.
We have Jane Lewis, who is the Director of People and Development at Allens. Welcome, Jane.
Thank you.
And we also have David Field, who is the Chief Legal Counsel at Canon Oceania. Thank you, David.
Thanks, Jerome.
We're really excited to have all three of you here today, and we're going to kick right off by asking how flexible working operates in each of your respective legal spheres. So Paul, you represent new law, Jane, you are big law, and David, you are representing the in-house legal space. And Paul, I might start with you. How does flexible working operate in a new law sphere?
Yeah. Jerome, I think we're fortunate to have three different perspectives on flexible working. Firstly, in respect of our lawyers. So our lawyers who are taking have made a proactive choice. They want to have some control over when, how, and for whom they work. So when, whether it's part-time, whether it's unusual hours, whether it's working in bursts, on project bursts, and how, whether it's working perhaps remotely, on site, and location. So would somebody be better working, would it be more flexible for them to be working from, for example, in Macquarie Park or in North Sydney or a central CBD location, and that sort of flexibility which inherently leads into their own personal obligations and commitments. Secondly, from a management team perspective. So I guess we as an organisation are passionate about what we do, and we absolutely try and live and breathe the values which we embed within our lawyers, and one of those is flexibility. So from a management team perspective, we have about a management team across Australia of about 25, 30 people, and there are numerous examples within that team of people working flexibly, whether it's working, again, school hours, or whether it's working part-time, or whether it's taking elongated periods of time off because of personal commitments. So that management team thing is critical to us. And for us, I think it's about trust. It's about, we would only employ people within the organisation who we trust. And if you trust somebody who's working for you and with you, then you sort of have to trust that they're going to deliver their role, their workflow in as close to the most efficient way as possible. So that management team thing for us is key, because it leads into everything we do, both from a lawyer and a client perspective. The third perspective is the client perspective for us. And I guess we're very fortunate in having day-to-day interaction with something like 500 or 600 clients globally. We get to see how those sometimes local SMEs, sometimes large corporate global organisations live and embed flexibility themselves. So we get a real sort of overview of the market. Of course, once our lawyers are embedded within a client organisation, they become part of that workflow, and so they clearly have to become part of the team, and there are constraints because they have to work as part of that team. But what we are regularly impressed by is the amount of buy-in and support that our clients have for the decision that our lawyers have made in terms of the flexible working environment, and that is a constant. It is rare that we find a client who isn't supportive of the way in which our lawyer has chosen to engage. And again, if there is an element of trust in how we are operating and how our lawyers are operating and are going to deliver for our client, then 9 times out of 10 they're fully supportive. So I guess we're fortunate to have those three different perspectives.
That's great. And Jane, what about in the big law space, which some might see as being one of the harder traditional moulds to break or bend? So how can flexible working operate in a big firm like Allens?
Yeah, it was interesting because I think that's definitely the mindset, but I was just listening to Paul, and actually there's lots of similarities between how I suppose flexibility plays out for us and how it is playing out in terms of new law. We did a survey last year, because obviously we don't track lots of forms of flexibility, and nearly 50% of our population now identifies regularly working flexibly in some way, which I think is a real challenge to that traditional construct of flexibility. And it probably plays out in three key ways. So there's obviously formal flexible arrangements, which fundamentally form part of someone's employment contract or the ongoing relationship that we negotiate with them, and that might be sort of traditional constructs like part-time, but it might also be alternative hours or extra annual leaves that you can take more school holidays, etc. And often what we see is those things going hand in hand. So for example, one of our managing associates, and managing associate is our partner track role, works 4 days with one of those days from home. So it's not necessarily just one component of flexibility, but it's often a bit of a jigsaw puzzle. And then there are more informal flexible arrangements, which is more like I need to work from home today because I need to let the plumber in, or I want to go to the school carnival, or I've got this particular sporting event that's important to me. And that's more on the ad hoc flexibility. And as Paul said, sort of trust is a big basis of the relationship and the contract that we have with our people. And it's kind of just let us know what you're doing and we trust you to kind of make all of that work. And then the final element I would probably describe as the kind of flexibility that you need in order to make the pressures of working in big law sustainable and workable for your broader kind of family and personal commitments. So, for example, we have people who might leave to do a child pickup and do a swimming lesson and then log back off, or people who want to be at home particular nights of the week for a family meal or a sporting event or some other kind of personal commitment that's really important. So people are sort of quarantining how much time they can spend in their office, making that other commitment and then getting back online later on to finish up anything that's urgent. And then the final thing I'd add is that recently we've been experimenting with whole team approaches to flexibility, and we've found, it's early days yet, but we're finding that very helpful in terms of fundamentally starting to shift the dial.
Yeah, that's great, and certainly want to hear more about that. But David, I want to throw to you now and tell us how flexible working can operate in an in-house environment.
Thanks, Jerome. Before I do that, if I can just sort of build on a couple of points that Paul made. I think one was in relation to trust, and just we heard that again from Jane. I think that's just absolutely critical in this space, and I think for a business, for a manager, I think understand, particularly in the sorts of businesses that we work in, understanding that actually you're trusting people with much bigger decisions than basically sort of how they spend this hour or that hour. So I think that trust aspect is fundamental. And then I think also the interesting to hear from Paul in relation to you didn't say it, but I sensed that there was perhaps you weren't entirely confident that you would have such a receptive response from your clients, and you did, and you found an almost universally receptive response, and that for me is a very, very strong theme around actually, I think in the flexibility space, just actually having the courage to actually have the conversation and sort of be surprised by how much understanding and how much flexibility can be there. But just sort of turning to sort of to our context, probably sort of two key aspects for me. One is in-house as a legal workplace in its own right, and what flexibility means for us there. And then the other is, I think, the critical role, as we were just sort of signalling, of in-house of the the corporates, really as the customers here, the clients, and the critical role that they play in relation to I think the environment in the rest of the profession for flexibility. So speaking in terms of sort of in-house as a legal workplace in its own right, I've got 8 people in my legal team between Australia and New Zealand, and of those 8 people, I've only got 3 working full time, including myself. So the rest of the team, work flexibly. Work part-time, and that ranges from a couple of people working 4 days a week down to, I've actually got one person who just started last week who's actually working 1 day a week, and there's a sort of a particular setting for that. But probably cost and efficiency is a very significant factor for me, and so being able to buy little discrete bits of people's time to solve particular problems, which are I guess at the end of the day is your business model, is very, very useful to me. So I get a lot of benefit from that flexibility, and from sort of there's someone who's looking for 1 day a week of experience, income, sort of work. And that's that's all I can afford to solve a particular problem. So that works fantastically for me. And then in relation to corporates as customers, I think it's really important that corporates as clients are very conscious of what their real values are in relation to things like diversity and equity and flexibility. And your values don't end at the point that you outsource. And if you've got particular values in relation to society, in relation to your internal team, and sort of how you approach the workforce internally, you can't solve problems by shipping the problem offshore or shipping the problem into someone else's business. And I think it's particularly important, again, probably going back to what Paul said around, the trust relationship between a service provider and a client. It's important for the client to, I think, be conscious of that and be conscious of the signals that they're sending, be conscious of what the apprehension might be conscious of what the conversation might be that hasn't been had, and be conscious of the need to, I think, proactively, demonstrate that you're welcoming of flexibility and supportive of having access to talent in external service providers, and sort of conscious of the fact that that might require you to accept that they're working, flexibly or part-time.
You mentioned that there's a role for clients to play, and you did as well, Jane, and I want to turn to that shortly. But David, I might throw to you on this next question first. When it comes to that trust that all three of you mentioned, what is the role of managers in any legal team, whether it be big law, new law, or in-house, to foster collegiate, hospitable workplaces through which employees can feel comfortable actually having the conversation about any idiosyncratic needs that they might have pertaining to their family situation, or even just the way that they're going to work most productively? So how can managers sort of step up and really take charge in that scenario?
Yeah, look, I think I'm probably particularly blessed in having been a manager of lawyers for most of my career, and the reason I say that is, we used to sort of, in the Telstra in-house team, we used to sort of joke about lawyers as being sort of insecure overachievers. So much of the management role is not actually about getting them to perform. So much of the management role is often about protecting them from themselves. Lawyers, I guess in my experience, so many lawyers are always looking for that reassurance, sort of concerned that perhaps they're not good enough or not, sort of not getting high enough marks, they're not top of the class, whatever, and they need the reassurance. And so, particularly in a context of working part-time or working flexibly, there'll often be a lot of sort of baggage and guilt that comes with that. And particularly in today's society where we're all under so much pressure to be dragged in so many different directions and be a fantastic father, fantastic husband, so fantastic wife, fantastic lawyer, sort of fantastic sort of member of the P&C committee, whatever, and just people are sort of spread so thin and feeling so guilty about sort of not being able to live up to what they want to be in relation to all of those areas. So I think just with a bit of perspective and maturity, actually being able to reassure people around that, I think is really important. Stop beating yourself up about it. This is what it looks like. You're giving me the hours and the commitment that I've purchased from you. You're doing a good job. Stop beating yourself up about it.
Jane and Paul, is this something that should be a KPI for managers in legal institutions?
Look, I think certainly the broader kind of pastoral care and support, I think that David's referred to, should absolutely be something that's a key expectation of managers and partners. I mean, one of the things that we often hear from the people needing to work flexibly is that they really value it when partners in particular point out to them that, look, their careers are a long-term game, and that actually if they need to adjust the settings at this particular point in their career, they've got, whatever it is, 10, 20, 30 years over which to manage their career. So I think that reassurance and sort of support that David referred to is really critical. And then I think there are other things that partners and managers can do to kind of, as you say, sort of foster and make that environment more hospitable. On the positive side, I think it's important for partners and managers to do things that sort of explicitly role model what it is that they're doing in their own lives, because often when we get to that level in our own careers, we have significant autonomy. It's easy for us to kind of dial up the settings up and down to sort of suit our needs and purpose. But we could be in a meeting, we could be offsite at a conference. It's not necessarily visible to the team where we are. So being clear and explicit when we're baking flexibility into our work structures is helpful. And I think
the term, the term I've heard there is sort of leaving loud.
Leaving loudly.
So not sneaking out.
Leaving loudly.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So bye. I'm going because I'm going
I
to pick my son up from school today, and I'm going to take him to his basketball practice because I haven't seen him practice for the last 2 months.
Projecting
just
it.
owning it and projecting it. Absolutely.
Absolutely right.
Yeah. And I think the other thing just to recognise can be very toxic is what's sort of framed as just joking. So if someone is walking out the door at 3 o'clock, oh, good of you to show up, you know, enjoy the afternoon, that kind of thing just absolutely has to be stamped out and not tolerated, even if there's not any sort of malintent behind it.
Can I build on that? Because I mean that's a critical point for me. Is particularly when people are feeling sort of possibly a little bit insecure or a little bit guilty about their flexibility. Sort of trust is kind of so hard won and so easily crushed. And those jokes about well, I wish I could go home at 3. For example, like that. It might just be a sort of a dumb sarcastic comment, but it can have an enormous impact on actually people's perception of the permission they've got to work flexibly. So you've got to be so mindful of the environment that you're setting with that sort of commentary.
Those signals.
And look, from our perspective, I mean, it's about communication. So it's open communication within the business. That it's not a career limiting move to want to work flexibly or to need to work flexibly. We've got examples of lawyers who have gone on, worked for us for a number of years and gone into other roles, who have maintained those, gone into GC roles, one guy who needs to be overseas a couple of months a year, another guy who runs a film production business part-time. They've gone into other roles in large in-house corporates and have maintained those working arrangements. So it's clearly not career limiting, and that's where we need to make sure that's clearly communicated. I think secondly, the leadership point and leaving loudly, I think it's the CEO of PepsiCo who talks about leaving loudly. Absolutely, it's about leading from the front. You don't your bosses shouldn't be sloping off at 3 o'clock embarrassed that they're leaving to pick the kids up once a week. If you're saying I'm leaving now because I'm picking the kids up, I want to spend a couple of hours with them and then I'm going to log back on later on, that's fine. And that sort of real genuine practice sort of then flows down through the organisation. I think the third point that we haven't touched on yet is around technology, and where we're going to encourage people to proactively work remotely, for example, or even working 3 days a week but needing to be available should something come out of the blue. It's about having a technology that supports that, so we're not expecting people to have to come back into the office, that they don't feel because they're working remotely that they're completely cut off from the organisation. So it's about being able to have regular touch points through technology, whether it's Skype or whatever it is, so that they feel visible within the organisation. They feel that they have a route back to a regular touch point back into the business. They don't feel that they're sort of marooned just because they're working remotely.
Okay.
And also that they can feel that they're efficient while they're working remotely. And I think technology has come a long way in that regard.
Well, speaking of technology, for all of those of you who are watching this, either at home or in the office, we have a chat function available through the web stream that you're currently watching. And if you want to send through any questions to our panel, please do so, and we'll get to those towards the end of this broadcast. But Paul, I wanted to follow up on something you said about transparent communication. Obviously, Jane and David, you also touched on this and how important it is. But as part of that transparent, open communication that an individual can and should be having with their institution about any flexible working arrangements they want to implement, is there a certain amount of pragmatism that also needs to be factored in to these conversations in order to best cater to the needs of your clients, for example, and also to ensure that a legal team is functioning harmoniously and that they're all in sync?
Yeah, absolutely. And that pragmatism works both ways. An organisation needs to. I think the days of flexibility, meaning working 4 days a week, it's a fairly limited view on flexible working. So it needs to be a very open discussion. It needs to be a real sort of really exploring where the needs and personal commitments and obligations of the individual can meet the commercial reality and requirements of the organisation. And 9 times out of 10, that doesn't necessarily equate to working 9 till 5 days a week. There are efficiencies, and I think David touched on it. There are significant efficiencies to be had, very often in cost saving even, to be properly mapping out workflows and saying, okay, how can this best be resourced? And I say very often it does not equate to an entire team working 5 days a week. From an individual's perspective, also got to be pragmatic. Clearly, there are, particularly in the legal sphere, there are functions, there are roles and sectors and types of workflow that just can't be done flexibly. You know, there might be an M&A transaction where it's all hands up to the pump and people are working 7 days a week. So there's got to be some pragmatism there. But even there, you know, we increasingly see organisations bringing lawyers in for bursts. You know, coming in on a transaction and working all the hours that God gives for 4 weeks, but then disappearing for a week. You know, so even in those sort of high pressured environments, there's a level of pragmatism that we've all got to adopt. And it doesn't. I say it's not just about. I don't believe flexible working is just about working 3 or 4 days a week. There's a lot more to it, and it's about investigating how you meet the requirements of the commercial organisation with the sort of personal obligations of the individual.
Right.
Jerome, can I link that back to something that Jane said, where Jane said that they were trying to work on a sort of, I think, whole team flexibility, and I've never seen it done well, but my instinct, my intuition is that that's where nirvana is. That's the solution there. And I can't remember what the technical term for it was, but I think it was Accenture that actually was looking at this as a model, really around, you know, some of these projects are just not sustainable. You know, just cannot be done, you know, in a sustainable, healthy way for an individual. They are, you know, it is all the hours that God sends, you know, for 6 months, 9 months, 12 months, you know, several years. And in order to manage that sustainably, you actually need to start from the outset with almost like a relay approach, almost like a job share approach, you know, sort of understanding that people will, you know, sort of phase in, phase out of a project, and you've got, you know, the right sort of handover arrangements, you've got the right understanding with the client, you know, sort of issues don't get lost, they're being tracked. But I think that's going to be the solution for some of those really big, you know, M&A projects or, you know, sort of, you know, infrastructure projects. Big litigations, you know, how do you actually set up a team model to, you know, to resource those?
Yeah.
And what about for the client considerations? You were touching on this before, but Jane, I want to bring you in here as well. You know, how can we factor in clients with the conversation about flexible working, and you know, what do you do in a scenario whereby a client is demanding that somebody is at their desk 9 to 5 in that sort of more traditional, rigid structure that we're so used to?
Yeah, I mean, as it's been commented on a couple of times, I think client organisations who are really trying to grapple with this issue themselves are usually both proactive and supportive. So we've had a number of instances where clients have anticipated, usually when it's sort of very obvious, admittedly, when someone's about to go off on parental leave, that someone is likely to need some kind of phased return, and they've said to us, that's the person we really like dealing with, we want them back on the team when they return, and we're willing to do whatever it is that we need to support them to return flexibly. So I think sometimes the barrier to the client conversation is maybe not as significant as we imagine it to be, but I think there is the pragmatism needed around sometimes the nature of particular deals and particular work. So again, for example, in our M&A practice in Melbourne, we had a senior associate, and her ideal working pattern was, we try actually not to even talk about days of the week because as you said, it's kind of not really a relevant construct, but her ideal was sort of a 60% load, but she recognised during peak periods of transactions she would need to dial that up, and so she had the infrastructure in place that she could work more than that when there were particular compression points. So I think clients can actually be a key enabler in making this work well.
Yeah. I'm interested in a word you used just before, which was barriers to having these positive and productive conversations. And I want to put it to you in the context of a younger lawyer who's maybe, you know, 2 or 3 years PQE, who is interested in flexible working or perhaps feels the need for it, but maybe at the same time doesn't feel like they have enough runs on the board to be able to come forward to their manager with that kind of proposition. In the context of a big law firm like Allen's, how can that operate? You know, is it just sort of luck of the draw as to who your senior associate or partner is? You know, how can a young lawyer feel comfortable about having that conversation?
Well, I mean, certainly, as Dave mentioned before, if you happen to be working in a team that is trying to put a team-based approach to flexibility in place, and we've certainly had a number of experiments with this, it becomes much easier because you divorce the idea of flexibility as being some kind of entitlement that you earn over the course of the maturation of your career, and it's actually how can we facilitate this for everyone. So I think it's much easier in those contexts. And we certainly have examples of where people perhaps very early in their career have needed to work even on a part-time basis, and we've been able to accommodate that. So I think that maybe traditional constructs of flexibility, which is it's something you do when you're experienced, it's probably more likely to be for a female and for childcare reasons, are really breaking down. And we know that there's a lot of literature on how motivated millennials are by kind of a broader balance in their lives, and I think organisations are trying to find a way to accommodate that in different ways.
Yeah. Well, I certainly would agree that it's more about having that mindset shift towards realising what's going to help the team be most productive and successful, as opposed to adhering to preconceived notions of what a workplace environment looks like. But you mentioned certain flexible working arrangements that females, for example, could utilise. And so, Paul, I wanted to ask you, in the new law space, which is, I suppose, seen as being different everywhere you go, in terms of how they set themselves up. What are some examples of ways in which males and females can respectively implement certain flexible working arrangements for themselves?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, touching on that point, first of all, in terms of males and females, I think it's important that, as Jane says, I think the days of flexible working being about childcare issues, for example, and gender are gone, hopefully. Both males and females have personal obligations and commitments, be that family or personal interests outside of the workplace. And I also think that there's no question that, for example, increasing flexibility for males will enhance his female career opportunity as well. So I'd like to think that the gender sort of conversation is sort of dissipating slowly. But yeah, look, there's numerous examples. There's working remotely. There's working on site for 2-3 days a week and working from home a couple of days a week. There's irregular hours, working school hours, or there's irregular hours working. As we're increasingly becoming a large global organisation, our management team is increasingly expected to be on calls with the UK or the US, at irregular hours. But that's okay, because we know that we get it back in more ways than one during the working day. If we need to leave and see the kids, or we've got something on a Friday morning or whatever, that's fine. And so again, it comes all the way back to the trust element, I think.
Okay. So David, you mentioned earlier that in your specific team at Canon, you have a number of lawyers who work part-time, and there's only, I think, 3 of you that work full-time. In any sort of in-house legal team, how can some of these arrangements operate for the team in order to function at 100%?
Probably, if I can throw back to, obviously pre-Canon, 19 years in-house at Telstra, and I think one of the fantastic things that Telstra did at the corporate level, not just within the legal team, was all roles flex, and what that meant was actually that roles would be advertised as, talk to us about how this role could be done flexibly. And the assumption there was that you should work on the assumption that a role can be done flexibly, unless there's a business reason why it can't. And what I love about that is it just says that we're open to the conversation. So I think while sort of Canon doesn't explicitly talk in terms of the all roles flex, it is there. It's there. Obviously, perhaps it would be good to, now that I think about it, it might be good to dial it up. But that assumption is there, that we're always up for a conversation around what your needs are in relation to, how we can make it sustainable. And probably just, we talked a bit about the communication point. I think, so much of it is about having the confidence to not hide the fact that someone's not there, or actually having the confidence to, actually put on the out of office reply, sort of put your working hours, working days on the bottom of the email, just put it out there so that everyone knows, it's shared and people understand, this person will not be here on this day. You need to organise your workflow, in order to use the time and the capacity that you've got available, and not impose on them on a day that we haven't paid them to be at work.
I'm getting a strong sense from all 3 of you that there is increasingly a sense of mainstreaming about flexible working, and it's becoming more and more pervasive into what we understand to be the traditional legal professional workplace structures. Jane, is this a trend that's happening? Is flexible working becoming more of a mainstream thing? And if so, what does this mean for the legal profession in Australia?
Look, question whether we're there yet, but I think certainly that's where we're trying to get to. And in picking up a couple of points that David's made, I think there's a couple of ideas in the mainstreaming. One is kind of the assumption that unless there's a compelling business reason that all roles might be able to be done flexibly. That doesn't mean all roles can be done part-time. Part-time is a component of flexibility. And I think the other side of it, which David also referred to earlier, is the idea that actually flexibility could be something that adds value to your business, not detracts value from your business. That actually there's a way of constructing roles on a flexible basis to get more value, to kind of, bringing niche skill sets for a particular period of time when you might be able to afford for them full-time basis, etc. So I think we're definitely down that path, but I think it will involve shifting the conversation more from individual needs, because I think there's only so long and for a particular proportion of your team base that you can construct things sustainably only focusing on the individual. At some stage you have to take the conversation to the team, and the team has to be part of the conversation about, well, what are the barriers to us working in a different way, and how can we work together to solve those barriers and put in new ways of working to meet all of our needs, so that all needs are kind of seen as being not the same, but of being of equal importance.
Okay. If it is more about the team, how would you say that, Paul, that operates within the context of the emerging and flourishing gig economy that we're seeing across all industries, not just in law?
Yeah, look, I think there's no question that flexible working is to some extent inherent, I suppose, within the gig economy. People who are working within or proactively decided to work within the gig economy, I guess, have proactively made a decision that they want to have more control over when they work, for whom they work, and how they work. So I guess it's inherent to an extent. From an organisation perspective, again, coming back to a couple of comments David and Jane have made about efficiencies, I think there's, just as a general comment about the gig economy, there's no question that organisations are increasingly aware that there are certain workflows and roles where it may be more efficient to be engaging people on a gig by gig basis. And again, coming back to earlier comments, it's about no surprises. It's about people coming into an organisation, whether it's in the gig economy or whether it's as a traditional employee, and having the conversation, saying this is the basis on which I'm happy to be engaged. And then it's for the organisation to work out, is this the right person? Have they got the right skill set? Are they the right fit for the organisation? And if they are, can the two marry? And 9 times out of 10 they can. And I think, again, going back to the mainstreaming point, there's no question, certainly from our organisation, we'll identify a requirement within the business, a commercial requirement within the business, whether that's on the P&D side, client solution side, finance side, whatever, or the lawyer side. We identify a requirement within the business, identify who we'd like to undertake that requirement within the business, and can we put the two together? And I say, if you've got the right person, the right skill set, and the right outlook on life, 9 times out of 10, it doesn't necessarily have to be done 5 days a week. Or 9 till 5. So, yeah, absolutely.
I've been checking the iPad here and I can see lots of questions that you guys have sent in. Thank you very much for that, and we'll get to those in a minute. But I wanted to ask just one last question, and David, it's to you. Now, you are a board member of Minds Count, which is formerly the Tristan Jepson Memorial Foundation. And so I wanted to ask, when it comes to the implementation of flexible working arrangements, both from an institution for their team members or for individuals going forward to their managers to ask for flexibility, are there any particular mental health considerations that need to be taken into account in order to, first of all, obviously ensure somebody's personal well-being, but at the same time also ensure their professional productivity and success?
So I think Jane made the point around flexible working over a 20, 30-year career as being a sort of a fundamental aspect of sustainability. Sort of understanding that you aren't over 20, 30 years, you're not necessarily going to have the ability to to bring full-time work sort of every day, every week to the market. So I think that's already a very important aspect in relation to sustainability. Sort of understanding that we effectively are we're the product. Our cognitive function is the product that we're bringing to market, and so we have to look after it. and we have to sort of make sure that we run it sustainably for the career. I mean, throwing back to the sort of one of the key, I guess, sort of key assets or key tools of MindsCount actually is the TGMF guidelines, which, for me, just continue to pay dividends. There's just so much depth in there. There's just sort of so much relevance in there in relation to the guidelines, and fundamentally, I think they go to aspects of leadership, and sort of probably two I want to highlight probably are sort of clear expectations, and then sort of sustainable workload. And I think they're really important in relation to making flexibility work. Actually, understanding that, I think Paul was making the point in relation to this is the basis on which I'm prepared to be engaged. I guess the way I've sort of said that to myself in the past was around, this is what you brought to market and that is what I bought, and actually understanding that's what I bought.
Absolutely.
I bought 4 days a week, I bought 3 days a week, and actually then having the leadership accountability to actually make sure that I'm giving you 3 days a week of work or 4 days a week of work, not 7.
Yeah.
And obviously we're all lawyers. We understand there's this sort of give and take involved in there as well. But just not in a situation where someone possibly is already feeling sort of apprehensive, or perhaps in one part of them guilty about the fact that they're only working 3 days a week. Are they letting the team down? When you load them up with sort of 7 days a week of work and just expect them to sort it out themselves, then that's not going to work. That's going to be a very stressful situation for them, and the leader needs to take responsibility in relation to the client conversations, the business conversations that need to be had, and sort of assistance with prioritisation if the lawyer is not someone who's in a position to sort of understand the business context around around those conversations.
Okay. Well, we might turn now to some audience questions, and I'm thrilled to see that so many of you have submitted questions. And I'm going to put this first one to you, Jane. We have a question from Bob, who asks, where do you think law sits on flexible working in comparison to other professions or industries?
That is a very broad question. I think that certainly the construct of professional service firms has certainly been about full-time work and long hours, etc. But there are other organisations like construction, for example, that have exactly the same challenge. So I think that there are certainly probably a number of different industries which have had sort of full-time, long hours as the basis of their fundamental work pattern, and in varying ways are all trying to shift that.
Yeah, okay. This one's for all of you. It comes in from Graham, and he asks, for firms wanting to implement flexible working arrangements, where should we start? What type of flexible work should we start with? So if we're going from square one, for all three of you, what would be a good place to start?
It's that communication piece. It's identifying. It is identifying roles. It is identifying industry sectors and specialisations within a firm. Where we're talking probably from a big law perspective, I guess, where the conversation can clearly be had. And it's about, again, coming back to the leadership and leading by example. If people from the top down are leading this sort of this charge and are really living and breathing the value of flexibility, then that feeds into that conversation very early on. But it's also, again, going back to the point we discussed a couple of times, it's also the recognising that there will be some areas of the legal profession where it is simply very difficult to do, and that's okay. That's okay. That's fine to have that conversation as well. But it's an early conversation. It's when people are joining a business. It's an early conversation. Again, this is the basis on which we want to engage.
Yeah. Anything to add on that one, guys?
I mean, I'm my general starting point when starting something is trying to look at the business case, because if you're trying to get a business to do something different, the reality is there's going to be a question about what problem we're trying to solve or what opportunity are we trying to realise. And there's lots of research that's available in the public domain that gives insights into both sides of the ledger. But in my experience, that's not particularly compelling for leadership. It needs to be brought down to the organisational level. So
Sure.
I'd say start with that level. And the other thing I would say is that in my experience of kind of bringing this into organisations, there's often a lot of concern with flexibility that we're going to talk about opening the floodgates and that everybody might want to work part-time or everyone might want to work flexibly.
All of a sudden everyone will be at the beach.
Exactly right, which of course is not the reality. So starting small and making it feel safe, whether that's around the parameters that we give to what flexibility means as a starting point, or if it's about regular review points where we have the opportunity to say, actually, it's not quite working in this way, we need to shift it in this direction, but building that sense of safety while people are getting used to a new way of working, I think is really valuable.
David, what about for...
If I can just sort of build on one aspect of that, which is sort of not answering Graham's question, but I think that that regular review points thing is actually critical, particularly if you're trying an experiment. I think you've got to have the courage to try some new things, and then probably as a manager, probably just being apprehensive about the fact that once someone's got something, it's very easy for that to be, sort of to become an entitlement. And if you are trying something that's genuinely experimental, I think it's important to say, just to walk into it saying, we're going to try this for 3 months, we're going to have a review point here, and either of us can walk away and say it's not working at that stage. So I think that sense of, a very, very conscious, this is what we're going to do for the next 3 months. At this point, we'll work it.
In the context of the in-house sphere, though, because you're a legal team working for a larger business, do you have to go and get permission from the business in order to implement these kinds of arrangements?
No. So I have to live within my budget. And I guess what I'm saying is that actually flexibility is a wonderful tool to actually help me live within my budget. It means that I can sort of pick up sort of pieces of resourcing here or there to solve particular problems within my budget.
Sure. I think I'd just point to pick up on David's point. I think it's a less difficult conversation than it is perceived to be. I think talking about opening the floodgates, from an organisational perspective, people are worried that we start talking about flexibility and, as you say, everybody will be at the beach. It just doesn't happen. And the majority of people want to continue working, actually enjoy working in a structured environment, heavily structured environment and regular hours and all the rest of it. And also from an individual's perspective, it's perceived as a very difficult conversation. But again, 9 out of 10 line managers will welcome the conversation. You're doing a good job. How can we work on this together? So it's about sort of lifting that sort of mist of it being a difficult conversation to have.
Yep.
And actually, Jerome, probably sort of more directly responding to Graham's question, I was probably sort of struggling with the question because I was sort of trying to think back to a time where I actually had an environment that was totally sort of green fields in relation to flexibility. If you found yourself, I'd be very surprised to find that you actually did have an environment that was totally green fields in relation to flexibility. If you did, I think probably as the leader in that environment, it would probably be useful to start thinking in terms of sustainability for yourself and the role modelling you need to sort of to set in relation to claiming bits of flexibility to ensure that you're working sustainably. So I think probably sort of start there, lead from the front, and then I think open the conversation up with your people.
Okay. Now I've got a question here from Anonymous.
Him.
Sounds ominous.
Yeah, that's right. How is this really feasible for small businesses? So I'm assuming this might be sole practitioners or those who work in boutique firms, because a lawyer's role is heavily based on presenteeism. So what are the limitations and boundaries?
It comes back to David's point, I think. I think there is, clearly, sole practitioner or a small firm, it is harder because the team approach is harder, the team balance is hard to strike because there isn't a team. But a lot of that's client-led, I think there's a sort of embedded assumption that clients require you to be on call 24/7. And I think, again, touching on some of David's points, whether it's internal clients within a Canon or whether it's external clients of Allen's or LOD or whatever, again, there is a growing acceptance that that's not the case. It doesn't need to be the case, and particularly with technologies to support sort of remote communication. Absolutely, it's going to be harder in a small business environment. But again, I think the days of the assumption that a lawyer can be called at 3 o'clock in the morning on a Saturday morning are sort of gone. And that's about, again, an open and honest discussion with the client to say, this is when I'll be available. Now, again, I totally accept that that's harder and harder the smaller a business gets, but I personally think that's the starting point.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think it's important to remember that not all forms of flexibility or even any kind of flexibility necessarily work for all job roles. I think that what we're saying is the key is to challenge the assumption that jobs need to be done in a particular way and isolate what might really be constraints for the role versus where are the options for the job to be done in a slightly different way.
Okay. I have another question from Anonymous here. It's amazing how many people have the same name. It says, often people working 3 days are expected to fit 5 days into that 3 days. How does the panel recommend managing this situation? And this is probably one that's quite pertinent for us. We hear a lot about people who work part-time, or maybe they have young kids at home, and so they're only working, say, 2-3 days a week, but still they somehow are expected to fit in more. So how does this relate to the conversation we're having about flexibility? What can managers do, and certainly what can individual lawyers do in response?
If I can jump in on that one, I think that's one where it really is about the clear conversation around how much resource we've got to apply to a particular issue and how much we're realistically going to get done. So I think those obviously, again, leadership, the leader has a critical role there in relation to actually being conscious of what work they're sending through or what work is coming through and the prioritisation. But I think also the leader's got a critical role in sort of helping with those, I think because particularly for people who come from a private practice background, they've got a very, very deep service ethic, and they really sort of struggle to say, I'm not going to be able to do that, or we're not going to get to that. But I think that's a very healthy conversation to actually help people around. Here is the resource that I have to apply to these issues that you have given me, and the issues that you need me to solve are more than I'm going to get solved. What's the prioritisation? What do you want me to attend to first? And I really encourage those conversations with with the business. We've done a lot of work on that sort of transparency with the business, where there's just way too much work coming through to be done, and I think often in-house that's going to be the case, because often with the way it's structured in-house, it effectively looks like a free resource to the business or to the individual clients, and so they just use it, and so the legal team needs to play a role in actually ensuring that the company's scarce legal resources are applied to the right, highest value issues first. Okay. And that ability to actually reflect back to the business, here is everything on my plate, and here's what I'm actually realistically going to get to, or here's what I'm focusing on over the next 10 days, over the next week or the next 10 days. And we do that, and that's a very, very useful conversation to be able to help the business to understand, your issues here, and I'm not going to get to it because I'm actually working on these.
Okay. Jane and Paul, would it be a similar scenario for big law and new law?
I think that's a particularly sort of likely possibility when someone's been doing a full-time role and then they transition down to a part-time role. And I think the step that's often missing is the actual review of the job and saying, okay, well, if it was 5 days and it's now 3 days, or it was 100% and now so 60%, something's got to change. So what is it that's going to change about that role? Is it now a job share? And I think sometimes that is the part that gets missed, not for poor intent, but there's just sort of, okay, sure, you're a valued person, exactly right, I want to accommodate that arrangement for you, let's put it in place without any thinking about how that it's actually going to work. And then I think also the review points that you were mentioning earlier are really important. And that if someone is in a position where they're being paid for 3 days and they're finding that they're working full time, they need to raise that, because that might not be visible to the manager.
Of course, well, it might not even be a lack of consciousness. It might actually just be a lack of transparent communication, which all three of you have highlighted as being of fundamental importance. Paul, what do you?
It does touch on a related point in terms of efficiency that David raised earlier on. Where sometimes from an organisation, the benefit from an organisation's perspective, it's a reset. We all know that work expands according to the availability of a person, right? But then if somebody is working, or the role has been being done full time, or somebody's been working full time and decides to wants to work 3 days a week or whatever, it's a reset for the organisation to say, okay, actually this job can be done more efficiently. I'm not talking about trying to squeeze 5 days into 3. I'm talking about an organisation standing back. Dave's a prime example in terms of talking about the majority of the team working part-time, and you've had to sit back and map out the workflows and work out what sits most effectively with who, and actually it's a cost-efficient way of operating. So often I say it can sort of act as a reset for an organisation.
Okay.
And I think particularly in an in-house context, I'm confident that if you doubled my team, we could keep finding valuable things to do. And as you said, the task expands to fit the resources available. And so it's important to actually just have the conversation around. These are all the, I'm not saying that that's not important, but these are all the resources we've got, and these things are more important, and we're going to do those first.
Okay. I've got a legal question for all of you here. It says, what is the impact on work coverage if you work from home? This is probably a good practical one for us all to consider. So let's say I'm a lawyer working from home and I fall off my chair and injure myself. Is that my responsibility? Is it my employer's responsibility? Do I have to sign a waiver to say that if I fall over and break my ankle while I'm working from home, that it's not the firm's fault?
Now, we certainly have an obligation as an employer to ensure that our employees are working in a safe working environment, and that includes being in the office or from home or wherever.
Okay.
Now, we're fortunate, I guess, as a profession, that we fairly rarely put our people in a truly dangerous situation, but absolutely we're responsible to make sure that if somebody's working from home, they've got a work setup that fits the requirements and that is safe. So if we need to do that assessment, we will.
Yeah, and so we've actually, I've seen that done very, very effectively with effectively a checklist, actually sort of checking, going through even photos of the workstation, just making sure there's a proper desk, making sure people aren't sort of working with a laptop on their knees on the sofa or something like that. So yes, that becomes a workplace, and it's part of my obligation to provide a safe place of work.
Okay. Is flexibility something that's discussed at interview stage when you're hiring new lawyers?
Probably not as a matter of course for us, but certainly there would be occasions when it is. And obviously if that was part of what someone was looking for, we would welcome that conversation at the get-go.
Okay.
And look, from our perspective, I guess it's inherent in the business model, I suppose. So any lawyers that we're meeting, again, comes back to the point we've talked about previously. It's about on what basis can we engage. So I guess our business model is such that it's inherent in what we do. That's one of the first conversations to be had.
Okay, and I wanted to put one final question to all three of you. If you could respond in the context of your respective legal spheres, new law, big law, and in-house. Do you see flexible working arrangements as being the future of the legal profession in terms of day-to-day work? And if so, why or why not?
Yeah, obviously from our perspective, yes, it's inheriting what we do. I think the legal profession has come a long way. I think we've started a long way behind a number of other professions, but there's no question we've taken huge leaps in the last few years. I don't think it's necessarily the nirvana that everybody is working flexibly, but it's about the mainstreaming. It's part of the conversation. It's part of what we do. It's inheriting what we do, and it's about, again, making sure that we are meeting the personal obligations and commitments of our people and marrying them up against the commercial reality of both ourselves and our clients.
Okay, Jane.
That was very, very well put. I'm not sure that I have anything to add to that, but look, I think we have made huge grounds. I think that incorporating flexible working into the way that we do things is here to stay, and it's not necessarily about nirvana and everyone having neatly quarantined sort of working arrangements, but it is about a wide variety of flexible working mechanisms that are employed in combination of the individual circumstance and the business context, and imagining that they will be dialed up and dialed down over different sort of business and even sort of deal and matter cycles, but also over different sort of sets of personal circumstances. But I think we're being asked for it by our people, and we have to provide a compelling career proposition, and I feel like flexibility is part of that.
Yep. Great. Dave?
I concur. It's and just to spoil that, just to spoil the Christmas of that response. Look, I mean, it's not just the future; it's the present.
Yeah.
And in order to work sustainably in these very demanding careers for 20, 30 years, it has to be the reality. It has to be.
Well, that's as good a place as any to wrap it up. It's not the future, it's the present. David, Jane, Paul, thank you all so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
That's all we have time for. Thanks for tuning in. As I noted at the top of this broadcast, this was the first Lawyers Weekly webcast, and we will be running more in the future, so stay tuned for more information about that. We hope you have a great day, and we'll see you again next time.